G'day, mate. 40 here, looking at Twitter. Right, the governor of Texas announced arrests being made right now with regard to these pro-Palestine, anti-Israel campus protests, and arrests will continue until the crowd disperses. These protesters belong in jail. Anti-Semitism will not be tolerated in Texas, period. Students joining in the hate-filled anti-Semitic protests at any public college or university should be expelled. Okay, so I think it's a mistake to focus on the anti-Semitism element of these protests because Muslim students do have a legitimate case to make about how they may feel marginalized or excluded or intimidated as well. To me, the focus should be on law enforcement, right? Interest groups, when they try to make the case for themselves and their own interests, right, that doesn't tend to resonate with the majority population. If you want to be effective making your particular case, whether you're pro-black, pro-Palestine, pro-Jewish, pro-gay, right? You want to frame things in terms of the general interest, and law enforcement is certainly in the general interest. As soon as the first window is broken, right, these protests should be shut down, right? Nobody is opposed to free speech, right? Nobody reasonable is opposed to free speech for the pro-Palestine crowd, right? The reason that these protests have hit the news is because they've been so incredibly disruptive. Right, they have stopped the normal functioning of universities, which to me should be treated like any other business. And just as Apple and Disney and Google would not tolerate this kind of disruption in their workplaces, right, American university campuses should not tolerate it either. Here's a little bit from Howard Kurtz, Fox News.
America is on fire. That's not media hyperbole. More than 2,000 anti-Israel protesters arrested on college campuses. Terrible violence breaking out. Buildings being taken over. Police clashing with demonstrators who are harassing and intimidating Jewish students. For 2 weeks, I've been asking, where is President Biden? Why isn't he addressing this huge national crisis on television? I cannot fathom why he is not speaking out. When the White House says, oh, he's denounced all this. No, these are statements coming from a deputy press secretary. The next morning, under pressure from the media and his own party in an unscheduled event added at the last minute, the president finally found the words.
Destroying property.
Well, it wasn't pressure from the media. And to the extent it was pressure from his party, it was based on pragmatic self-interest. Right? These college campus protests split up the Democratic Party coalition and unite the Republican coalition.
Property is not a peaceful protest. It's against the law. Vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campuses.
Right, the only reason these protests have galvanized national media coverage is because of their illegal behavior, setting up encampments and setting off riots and intimidating Jewish students. Right, that's why they've captured national media attention. It's not because of the arguments themselves, right? Most Americans are pro-America. They don't really care that much about the Middle East. They don't really care that much about the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Campuses, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduations. There should be no place on any campus, no place in America for anti-Semitism or threats of violence against Jewish students. It's forcing the cancellation.
That took place after Donald Trump addressed the protests in a Fox interview after a full day in court and at a Wisconsin rally.
To every college president, I say remove the encampments immediately, vanquish the radicals, and take back our campuses. Biden should speak out. He should speak out. He should say something because nobody knows where he is.
Bottom line, the campus clashes are fueling a sense that these are bastions of lawlessness. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. At Columbia, anti-Israel protesters seized control of Hamilton Hall and refused to budge until the school's president finally, belatedly, and much too late, called in the NYPD to evict them. Exactly 56 years after students occupied the same building in 1968. At UCLA, counter-demonstrators clashed with pro-Hamas protesters, both sides armed with weapons, and police eventually broke up the illegal encampment and made arrests in a pre-dawn raid.
Right, so Ann Coulter is not happy with Greg Abbott, and she responds, great to see Republican governors abandon free speech the moment they don't like the speech. This is why we have a First Amendment, otherwise it's always speech for me but not for thee. Almost nobody with intelligence is denying the rights of the pro-Palestine crowd to make their case, right? The reason that these protests have captured attention is because of their illegal behavior, their disruptive behavior. They're stopping the normal functioning Does anyone notice a difference in the police response between the Black Lives Matter protests and the Palestine protests? Well, both got away with a lot of bad behavior for weeks. Now, the pro-Israel, pro-Jewish crowd is more effectively organized than the pro-majority crowd in the United States. And so they were more effectively able to bring pressure on the people running college campuses. But it's a mistake for Jews to focus on the anti-Semitic element. Focus on the disruption to the purpose of universities, which should be treated like workplaces. Right? Focus on the illegal behavior. Focus on broken windows policing. When you allow broken windows, all right, you encourage further chaos and anarchy and violence.
And there have been arrests elsewhere, everywhere, from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to Dartmouth, to the University of Utah, often aided by weak college leaders and abetted by the lure of television cameras. And the coverage and commentary have cut across partisan lines.
This is a situation where the protest movement has sided with an enemy, has sided with a terrorist organization. They want the destruction of the state of Israel.
This is people talking about genocide, screaming at them as they try to go to their English class on campus.
Remember on the January 6th, they smashed the window, right? That was a war crime.
Right, there should be nothing illegal about advocating against the existence of the state of Israel. Right, that's just a political position. The Kurds don't have a nation state. Right, there are a lot of nations that don't have a state.
But they do it here, and it's like, well, do you want another pizza?
This disruption amongst on American campuses and crime, it feeds into the broader narrative of America being out of control.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, editor-in-chief of The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. And Tim Hogan, Democratic strategist who has worked for Amy Klobuchar. Molly, how could Joe Biden have stayed silent for 2 weeks, except for a terse answer to a producer's shouted question, as the violence escalated, as the arrests escalated, as this became, by far, the biggest story in television news and elsewhere?
Yeah, he finally said something after weeks of this going on campuses nationwide. But I think the problem is that this is really the natural result of something that has taken root in the Democrat Party. You remember right after 9/11 when President Obama's pastor got in trouble for talking about the chickens coming home to roost. Jeremiah Wright was talking about support for Palestinians in that moment. 4 years ago, we saw how Nancy Pelosi led her Democrats in Congress to kneel.
Right, pro-Palestine support does largely correlate with encouragement of illegal behavior and encouragement of terrorism. That's why most Americans have an instinctive revulsion against the pro-Palestine crowd. Also, because most Americans don't see what's in it for them. Like, how do they benefit by being on the side of Palestine?
For the social justice issues that have really taken over the Democrat Party. And so it's very difficult for President Biden. He knows these things are very unpopular, but he also knows that they are present in his party to the point that you have members of Congress that are supporting these protests.
Well, he has largely taken some hits, Tim, for mostly.
Okay, so the New York Times, as you would expect, really gave the kind of elite center-left perspective on these campus protests in their weekly podcast, Matter of Opinion.
For academic institutions and more broadly, just for our politics. But to kick us off, I want to get down into the weeds on the campuses. And Lydia, you spent a lot of time reporting on the protests at Columbia last week. So you want to tell us what you saw?
Yeah, I have sort of an unusual vantage point on this whole situation. I just happened to be at Columbia 2 weeks ago. I was speaking at a class the day that the president of Columbia, Manoush Shafik, decided to...
Right, this is hilarious that she thinks she has a unique perspective on this situation. She is articulating the dominant perspective among the elites who dominate our college campuses and dominate almost all of our institutions. And if she'd never set foot on any campuses, she would have the exact same opinion. Right? What's particularly interesting is when you listen to people who have firsthand experience of a story, and that firsthand experience then changes their perspective. But when you listen to Lydia here, it hasn't changed her perspective one iota. This is the identical perspective that she brought into the story.
To call in the NYPD. I saw the encampment. It was a bunch of kids hanging out, chanting various slogans, none of which seemed particularly outre to me, but I, was sort of stunned to see an hour later that they had decided to bring in the NYPD. And those same arrested students I caught up with a few hours later.
Now, why was she stunned that they brought in the NYPD? Because it seems there's a left-right difference here with regard to university college campuses. The right tends to view college campuses through the prism of a workspace, and the same sort of rules that you would apply in a workspace or in a public facility such as a Department of Motor Vehicles should also apply on a college campus. For people in the center left and the left, they believe that there should be a whole more relaxed set of rules, that kids on college campuses should be basically exempt from the normal rules of law enforcement. But why should criminal law not apply to college campuses?
Later, because I live a block from police headquarters, which is where they take protesters and process them and then kind of release them. So I've had a chance to spend quite a bit of time and do a fair bit of reporting and then return to Columbia campus. And, it's clear that there is a really, really, really strong and motivated movement out there for people who are really, really upset about what's happening in Gaza and want their universities and institutions to listen to their demands for various things, like divesting their endowments, changing other policies. And, I think a lot of people are asking,
And do you think that our next neurosurgeons, that our next line of doctors and our next line of lawyers are putting their futures on the line in this quixotic quest to change how campuses invest their money? No, it's overwhelmingly, I would suspect, the lower performing college students and the outside agitators, to use Fox News language, who are driving these protests.
These protests motivated by anti-Semitism, are they violent? I didn't see any violence. I think anti-Semitism it seems silly to try and pretend that there's absolutely none anywhere in any of these protests.
And the anti-Semitism angle doesn't really matter that much. What matters is the general interest, and general interest is law enforcement. The general interest is that law enforcement reacts when you get the first broken window, when you get the first disruption of traffic patterns, when you get the first disruption of normal business, normal campus life, right? As soon as you destroy the ability or reduce the ability of students to get an education, that's when the police should be called in.
Movements. But, these seemed like pretty peaceful, pretty chill student protests.
Not according to the kids on campus. All right, most kids on campus, apparently, I would expect just for rational self-interest, resent any disruption to their ability to enjoy campus life and to get an education. All right, the average expenditure to educate a kid on a college campus would be around $100,000, whether that money is primarily coming from parents, from students themselves, from businesses, or from public expenditure, right? All these different stakeholders, you would think, would be incentivized for campuses to conduct themselves like a business and to carry on educating kids and providing opportunities for their students, right, for their customers, and therefore would resent any disruption and dislocation and chaos.
That seems to have changed in the last 24 hours, just in the sense that both, at Columbia, where a group of students took over a very famous hall on campus, and then also around the country where there are lots and lots of other protests going on, there have been, in some cases, really violent counter-protests. So things do seem to be getting more and more hectic, and where this goes next is anybody's guess, but it seems really, really, really bad.
So we've seen these college administrators who are in the middle of all this trying.
So what's really bad to this left-wing commentator is law enforcement. All right, that this is Lydia Polgreen, a left-wing American journalist. All right, what seems really, she's African-American, she's on the left, and what's really bad to her is a disruption to illegal behavior, law and order. And I do think different groups have different attitudes and different experiences with law enforcement, right? Generally speaking, in America, it seems to me that whites and Asians want stricter enforcement of the law and harsher penalties for breaking the law, particularly with regard to violent crime. But with segments of the Hasidic Jewish community, segments of the Latino community, and a large part of the African American community, they want less law enforcement rather than more.
trying to figure out what to do, what role to play. And different schools are responding in different ways. I mean, do you guys think that any of them have responded notably well?
And there's silence.
Well, people on the right certainly don't believe that these protesters should be rewarded for their illegal behavior, for their disruptive behavior, for the enormous amount of graffiti and chaos and damage that they leave behind. Right, the pro-Israel side definitely has its flaws. It shows a repulsive face to the public at times, but they don't tend to leave behind massive amounts of damage and graffiti. Right, the pro-Trump, pro-Republican crowd, generally speaking, right, the supporters of the Tea Party did not leave behind large amounts of trash and graffiti. Right, when you think about the people who put graffiti all over the place and desecrate public life. All right, it's not usually Trump voters. It's overwhelmingly Biden voters. It's overwhelmingly people who would vote for the Democrats rather than for the Republicans. Now, I'm afraid to play for you, Victor Davis Hanson, because I'm afraid that he's going to radicalize you. And this show is not about hate porn. This show is about radical love and inclusion.
On American campuses, and the old idea that you could be pro-Palestinian, but you weren't pro-Hamas, or you could be pro-Gazan, but you're not. We've seen that's a joke, because most of the people on the campus are openly cheering on Hamas and what they did.
Do these protesters represent the similar threat to the protesters in 1968 when they were storming campuses across America?
Well, they're a little different in the sense that, number one, they were protesting an act of their own government. And I know that these people say they are, but they're mostly they say they're anti-American, and only to the extent that we give some aid to Israel. But in the 60s, the prime complaint was the American government was in a war. We're not in a war now. And now the complaint.
And so what power do these pro-Palestine campus protesters have? They have some power of truth on their side, in that it's probably not in America's best interest to be so deeply involved in the U.S. They do have a compelling case to make, right? It would probably be, to my limited amount of knowledge, right, more in America's interest to stop subsidizing Israel, right? Israel does not need our aid. And even if Israel needed our aid, America should act in its own self-interest. And I don't believe we should be subsidizing Israel, nor almost any country. And they have a powerful case to make that America is overextended in Europe and in the Middle East, and that America should focus instead on its greatest geostrategic rival, China. So we have all sorts of unnecessary bases and in the Middle East. And just what's going on in the Middle East is taking up way too much cognitive processing power on behalf of the Biden administration. You can't focus on 25 different issues, right? We naturally tend to focus on 3 or 5 issues. And so by devoting so much time to trying to moderate the Arab-Israeli conflict, right, we're taking America's attention away from where it should properly be focused. So there is a considerable, powerful case that the pro-Palestine crowd could be making. And some members of the crowd do make that case. On the other hand, the anti-social element of these protests on the side of the pro-Palestine crowd does seem to be winning out.
And the other complaint was it was the students against the administration, and they were coming from the left. Now I think you can make the argument that the students are just as much against other students that are Jewish as they are against the authorities. And while some Marxist Trotskyite groups have joined forces, if you look at what they are saying, it's not left-wing utopianism. It's kill the Jews, end Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit different. So far, they haven't.
And guess what? Most Israelis probably would wish that most Palestinians would just disappear. So it's not like, oh, only the pro-Palestine crowd is bloodthirsty. Look at those primitive Arabs or those primitive Muslims. I don't believe that for a second. Right? When you've got another group that is threatening your existence, right, you're going to loathe that group with a genocidal intensity. Now, it will usually be wise not to express such sentiments publicly. But I mean, I've walked around in LA with some passionately committed Zionists who will yell out death to the Arabs, which I think is an awful mistake. You don't want to say those things publicly.
And threatened suspensions, but refused to call in the NYPD until they had taken over that building.
Because Columbia University has spent decades building up this ideology within their own institution. And I do want to point out here, too, when we look a few years ago, when President Trump said that there were good people who did not believe in tearing down statues, he was destroyed by corporate media and other Democrats who were so upset that he said that. And they didn't even though he said it immediately within hours of a horrible protest breaking out in Virginia, they demanded that he say things a certain way and over and over and over again. And here you have the media just sort of being like, oh, it's no big deal that President Biden hasn't said anything here. But again, these institutions have been taken over by this social justice ideology. That's what these children, or these students, they're not children, are learning, and that's what they have been learning for a long time. And that's why when we talk about these protests, we do have to talk about the lies that are at the root of these protests, whether they're the lies that were told about during the BLM riots about what America is and what it means to be American, or whether they're the lies about the nature of the conflict between Israel and Palestinians.
Well, in fairness, I think.
And probably the biggest lie is denying that different groups have different gifts. I mean, that's what's at the core of these social justice protests. That's what's at the core of the dominant ideology, that we would have, equal outcomes if only we didn't have entrenched white supremacism, rather than facing up to the reality that different groups have different gifts. If we simply accepted that reality, then we wouldn't be surprised that different groups are disproportionately successful in different parts of life.
Resorted to some of the things that eventually came out of the '68 protests, like the Weatherman bombing, but we don't know where this is going to lead. The other big difference is primarily all the people on American campuses were U.S. citizens in '68, and I think there's a large minority, maybe 30 or 40% of the ringleaders at least, that are here on student visas from the Middle East.
Why are the left so good at organizing protests, whether it comes to the BLM riots in 2020 or today?
In large part because many of the most enthusiastic, passionate, dedicated activists on the part of the left don't have normal jobs. All right, they are subsidized by the state to carry out behavior that is contrary to the best interests of the American nation.
Well, they have this good propaganda.
Right, Republicans overwhelmingly have jobs, have families, have religious, social, and communal commitments, in addition to interests in hobbies and other parts of life aside from politics.
They have adopted a Marxist binary, and so that everybody is either a victim or a victimizer. And if they can convince authorities, mayors, governors, presidents, that they are part of the victimized minority, then they feel they're exempt.
And this victimization perspective depends upon denying that different groups have different gifts.
And that victimized minority, by the way, has got much, much larger, not because of increased fertility among blacks or Latinos or gays, but because people are identifying now in a way they did not in the past, Native Americans. So there were people.
Oh man, I'm scared to play this video. I'm afraid it's going to radicalize you. Isn't he implicitly, I'm afraid he's just going to start talking about some great replacement conspiracy theory, which seriously, I do not believe in.
People in these communities of mixed heritage that said that they were either white or of mixed heritage.
Now, he is touching on something important here. The United States Census Bureau, at the promptings of our elites, has steadily moved more and more groups out of the white category. So we now have Middle Easterners, we have Latinos, right? We have rearranged the United States Census to make it appear as though whites are a much smaller percentage of the population than they really are. So if you're 1/16 black and 15/16 European, right, and you put on the U.S. Census Bureau form that you're both black and Caucasian, right, you will only be counted as black, right? I am 1/16 Chinese. If I put on a U.S. Census Bureau form that I was Asian and Caucasian, I would only be counted as Asian. So the way we count people by race in the U.S. Census dramatically understates the percentage of the population that is Caucasian, which fuels a sense of outrage and apocalypse on the part of many people who are Caucasian and feel like they are becoming a minority in their own country.
But now, once this divide was established during the Obama administration, it became useful, or in careerist terms, to identify with the non-white victimized oppressed classes.
So do you see this as a race issue? They see Israel as being the white oppressor and Palestine as being the kind of brown minority. Is this very much to do with race?
So have you heard that saying attributed to the Duke of Wellington, who won the Battle of Waterloo, saying the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton? Right? That's a good model for how to run a school, how to run a high school, how to run a college, how to run a university. Right? You want to be training people for maximum contribution to your society, and subsidizing and permitting anarchy and disruption, such as these pro-Palestine protests, runs contrary to that model.
They think it is. Today at UCLA, there's been a clip going around where one of the protesters says to a Jewish person, you're white, and we at UCLA, the campus in question, do not like white people. And so they have transmogrified the Israelis into the overdog, white, privileged class, and that they feel that they're people of color. It's very absurd, though, when you see Israel.
Man, I should just fast forward through this. It's don't experience this as hate porn, guys. Please don't get radicalized here.
Israelis of all different races in the United States, and you see lily white Palestinian protesters saying that they're non-white and the Israelis are white, when some of the Israelis that they're demonstrating against are darker than they are. So it's quite confused, but they're straining to make this into race. The other subtext of the demonstrations are that we in the United States are in the third year following George Floyd of repertory admissions, where the old quotas, 12% Black, 12% Latino, 20% Asian, 70% white, were thrown out. So at a campus like Stanford University, where I work, 20% of the incoming classes have been white, maybe 9% white male. So what's happened is the DEI population is now the majority of the population. And out of that white small minority of 20% at Stanford, 30 or 40 in the Ivy League, you have to take legacies, children of faculty, athletes. So you're really not getting very many Jewish students. And that's an unspoken reality and then to pay for the huge tuition that's gone up faster than the rate of inflation. We have about 1 million foreign students from China, mostly in the Middle East. So the dynamic is there are people from the Middle East that are on campus in greater numbers than Jewish students. And
so one thing he's talking about is the flight from white is massively incentivized. So I want to play a clip from this
Testing
protest.
today has to do with the fact that nobody has ever invited us to any keggers on or off campus. We've never been invited to any parties. We've never even been looked at by any men. I mean, I used to be into men, but then I decided that it would be easier to be non-binary. So these are the main reasons that we are against Israel. It is also really frustrating that many of the Jewish students at this school seem to have large friend groups and are able to meet people and have fun and have a good time, and we just see that as colonialism at play. So without colonialism, we would be able to level the playing field and make sure that students like us would be the center of attention as opposed to popular people.
Okay, from TikTok. Right, I'm going to throw in a link to the chat so people can join the show. Where's my Victor Davis?
And then they appeal to their DEI American citizen brethren on the idea that they have ecumenical allegiance as non-whites. The other subtext very quickly is when you threw out the SAT, comparative ranking of high school grade point averages, which has happened, and you let in students on the basis of their ethnic or racial or gender identification that you, the university, would not have allowed in 3 or 4 years, not you or me, but what their standards were. And their curricula were geared to those standards. Then what's happened is the faculty either have to inflate the grades, such as Yale, where 80% of all grades are A's now, or they have to water down the course content, as happens at Stanford, or they have to introduce new gut courses.
And the chat says everything is anti-white. What's new? Well, everything is not anti-white. All right. If you're strongly identifying as an oppressed white person, then you're going to look at the world through a lens in which you magnify, every form of oppression. Just as if you're black or gay or Jewish, you can always find examples of oppression. But let's welcome Khalid Safir back to the show. Khalid, anything that you've seen so far that you want to comment on?
Hi, Luke. Thanks for having me on again. Appreciate it. So I'm not sure if it's just a left-right divide, as I just commented, especially with the Palestine thing, because there's a lot of Muslims who are behind it, and Muslims are very good at being organized because we're already communities up and down the world, basically. And I would say Muslims are not really, I wouldn't describe them as left. I wouldn't describe them left or right, but like mostly I'd describe them as right-winged in the sense that we're strongly conservative, family values, traditional values, and stuff like that. So I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but I don't want to dismiss the idea that there is a left orientation to protesting, because leftists see the world in a particular way, and that particular way usually is that the world is unfair. And it's systems that are oppressing us and stuff like that. Capitalism is terrible and stuff like that. And that's a dangerous thing. I recommend most people, when I do my live streams, by the way, I come on this show to advertise my stream, so do check out my username Khalid Safir. We're going to do a live stream tonight about why Western balls are shrinking, why testosterone is going down in Western countries. But anyway, I do think it's a dangerous thing to always blame the rest of the world, and I don't believe in protesting normally, but I do appreciate some of the protests that are happening because it kind of puts things in the spotlight. So I don't appreciate protesting necessarily because it's a short-term strategy to solving a long-term problem. Like the Israel problem happened over a long period of time. Complaining about it, saying it's wrong, isn't the best way, because the people who are doing it kind of know that they're wrong. Maybe they don't actually. Yeah, so I think there's all sorts of things. Like people on the right, they kind of love the status quo as well. They don't like. A lot of people on the right are well off, and there's stats showing that if you are rich, you stop empathizing with other people. The richer you become, the less empathetic you are, the less you care about the rest of the world in solving those problems, and you think people deserve to be punished and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of those kind of dynamics. I'm just interested in what you think about what I think, Luke.
That's a problem with running the show, is that you get distracted trying to keep up all sorts of different.
Okay, let me ask you a question, because because I'm a teacher, I find it difficult just talking, like sermonizing.
Yeah.
I like to know what people think about what I'm saying, kind of do a back and throw. So first of all, if we're talking about the Palestine situation, I think the most basic thing is that isn't it right to say do something about it? Like thousands of children being murdered. I do think there are other solutions that are. I'm an Ahmadi Muslim. We're kind of a revolutionary Muslim that based on using love rather than weapons and stuff. And we have actually solutions in Israel. We've got people in Israel talking to the top people in government for decades now. We're already making progress in many ways, but that's a whole different story. But isn't it a basic thing to care about thousands of children dying? So if people are protesting, it's not just because they've got spare time, like you said, because that's what you said. They're just people who don't have jobs. Isn't that the wrong way to look at it? Just to start off, I'm not completely against you. There's some truth in it, but isn't that the wrong way to look at it if thousands of children are dying?
Yeah, that should not be the primary lens. So I was talking about why are there, generally speaking, far more left-wing protests than right-wing protests. And generally speaking, it's because people on the right are much more likely to have jobs that require, say, showing up in an office 9 to 5 than people on the left. Now, with regard to the legitimate, what I, as a Zionist, see as a legitimate basis for concern and for outrage with regard to what's going on in Gaza, yes, I absolutely believe that the pro-Palestine crowd has a very powerful case to make. And there are approximately 35,000 dead people in Gaza. Should be upsetting to anyone that the majority of these dead people are women and children. It should also upset people, and that it's not in America's interest to be so heavily subsidizing Israel and to be so deeply involved in the Middle East. So I do think that there's a very powerful case to be made on the pro-Palestine side, and I would expect people to make it. My rejoinder to that is that the reason these protests have garnered so much media attention is not primarily or not necessarily that case, but it's because of the disruptive effect on the normal functioning of a college campus. And TV and journalists love conflict. They love fighting. They love seeing police and protesters going at it because it just compels attention. And so it's good for their business model to focus on that. So if these pro-Palestine protests were entirely law-abiding, I don't think they would capture as much attention.
Yeah, I think well, I don't want to call this silly, but yes, conflict does attract attention. I would say they're probably underrepresented in many ways. This is a massive thing that's happening. Thousands of people being killed, affecting the whole world, potentially drawing the whole world into a world war. And as far as I understand, I don't know what's your opinion. I don't really watch mainstream media so much, but what I see of it is the Palestine side of things are underrepresented because I think most people accept that mainstream media is in the hands of Zionists. So it's underrepresented in that sense. It's getting attention, but it's underrepresenting the viewpoints of the pro-Palestinian side, including Jews who are against Zionism. So there's that, but it does get a lot of media interest, and maybe it should. Why shouldn't it? Thousands of people dying, so not really going to count if they get much more attention or not. I don't think it's only just that. People like conflict. I think there's a just reason for that attention. People dying. Based on how many people are dying, it should get that much attention. Depending on, and also based on the fact that it's about to start, drawing in huge, very big countries into potential massive, maybe World War III conflict. So
yeah, let me agree with. Let me agree with much of what you just said. I do think that the pro-Palestine position has generally been underrepresented in the mainstream media. I'm mainly familiar with American media. I think the pro-Palestine case gets a much fairer hearing in Europe and possibly Australia. But there are no major pundits in the United States who are employed by the biggest media outlets who have been consistently articulating the pro-Palestine perspective. So I wouldn't describe the media as Zionist, but I would describe Zionism as having perhaps a disproportionate influence in the media, and definitely the pro-Palestine case has been dramatically underrepresented in American mainstream media. So I agree with much of your point.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised the level-headedness of your point of view, considering I didn't know you were a Zionist. You don't sound like a typical Zionist. So I'm kind of surprised. Do you want to explain how comes you don't support more mass murder of children?
Okay, so the reason that I can have almost tension-free discussions with people who are anti-Israel is
I'm not anti.
Right.
I'm not anti-Israel exactly. Not really.
Right, but I'm talking broader. So most of the people I've had on this show since October 7th have been anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and pro-Palestine. And the reason that it's easy for me to talk to people with the contrary point of view from my own, because I am Zionist, I am someone who converted to Orthodox Judaism. My friends are overwhelmingly passionate supporters of Israel and passionate supporters of the IDF. So I am conducting myself on these live streams, in a kind of dangerous way to my own social well-being. But I primarily focus on power, not on morality. So I am interested in how the world works more than I'm interested in how the world should work. And so when I talk to people from, say, a pro-Palestine direction, it's easy for me to hear them because I'm primarily interested in, like, how is power being used in this conflict? And the pro-Palestine crowd has some forms of power on its side, that it's winning the demographic war in the United States, for example. Young people are much more pro-Palestine than older Americans. Also, the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction movement against Israel, has been incredibly effective. And I don't agree with all these laws in American states trying to ban BDS. For decades, people in America in particular, and conservatives in particular, have said, why can't the Palestinians make their case peacefully? And then when the Palestinians do effectively make their case peacefully through BDS, then it's like outrage. Oh, this is terrible. So the reason that I come across the way I do is that I try to primarily look at the world in terms of different groups have different interests. And so I respect and understand people who are pro-Palestinian because that reflects their interests. And it doesn't bother me if they want the complete obliteration of the Jewish state, because I recognize that's in their interest.
I don't think the pro-Palestinian, there's a lot of pro-Palestinian Jews, right? They're not, I'm pro-Palestinian in the sense, I don't think Palestinians have done no wrong. That's kind of, there's a whole, maybe I should go into that a little bit because I've done live streams on this about solutions to the problem. But I'm not like against, I don't want Jews dead. A lot of Jews who are supporting the Palestinian cause for not being killed also don't want Jews dead. I don't think it's a binary of that sort. I think you're quite aware of that. But I do want to compliment you. The reason why I think you're able to have this balanced view is because you actually have discussions with other people, and then your views are always balanced. It's a really healthy thing to do. It's actually quite a rare thing to do. Very few people can come on camera and be recorded and have their points of view, articulate their points of view. And to do that, and for you to even have me on the show and other people on the show who have different points of view will automatically, I think, grow you, myself included, when we have these discussions. So I think that's one of the reasons. What do you think?